What's up, everybody? It's Chicago Talk Show host, and I'm here to talk to you about the book Christ in Dachau, written by Father John Lenz. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over some parts of the book that I liked and I think will resonate with you, and it's going to paint a picture of the story of Dachau, which was, of course, a prison camp during World War II, a German prison camp during World War II. So we're going to start off with the preface, which of course sets the tone for the book. And Father John Lenz, he starts off with a small print with a passage from the Bible, and it reads, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." That's Matthew 6:10. Father John Lenz, he writes in the preface, "What we priests were forced to endure under the Nazi regime, especially in Dachau concentration camp, is no more than a cup filled from the vast sea of human suffering in the world today. It is not this suffering as such that is important. The important thing is to show those who have crosses of their own to bear in life just what the grace of God can do for those who follow faithfully in the footsteps of Christ the crucified. It is no less important to reveal the wickedness of hell." He continues, "That is why I have written this account of our experiences, the original German version of which was published 11 years afterward. May this book have God's blessing. It is a record both for the world today and for posterity of the life, the suffering, and above all, the victory of the church during this satanic era." So I especially like this next part in the preface. He writes, "The power of the Catholic Church, a power that has no need to resort to arms, emerged victorious, just as it will always be victorious, as Christ himself proclaimed. Only through Christ and his church can the world be saved, as this book also shows." I'm going to read to you a couple of Father John Lenz. He writes in this book a couple of passages from the Bible, and he calls them God's words, words of comfort. So there's a couple I'm just going to share with you, and I hope it finds you some level of peace as you go through your personal adversity and challenges in life. "I am the light of this world." John 8:12. "I am the resurrection and the life." John 11:25. "I am the way, the truth, and the life." John 14:6. "Do penance, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." Matthew 3:2, 4:17. "It is by endurance that you will secure possession of your souls." Luke 21:19. And finally, "Your distress shall be turned into joy." John 16:20. He says, "Charity is the apostles' indispensable weapon in a world torn by hatred. It will make you forget, or at least forgive, many an undeserved insult. This charity, intelligent and sympathetic even toward those who offend you, does by no means imply a renunciation of the right of proclaiming, vindicating, and defending the truth and its implications." This first chapter, it's called Why. Okay. Father Lenz, he writes, "A great deal has been written about the ovation that greeted Hitler's troops as they marched through the streets of Vienna. The picture of cheering crowds waving Nazi flags and shouting Heil Hitler is, however, very deceptive. For all the thousands who lined the streets, there were thousands more sitting at home, behind locked doors, mourning the fate of their country. Too great importance should not be attached to the misleading demonstrations in the streets, for many of those who clamored for Hitler and the Nazis were just unfortunate dupes of the ruthless propaganda. Many were simply carried away at the moment by the tide of excitement, unable to resist the flags and the music and the crowds. There were others, too, paid organizers of the party, entrusted with the task of creating the right sort of atmosphere for a triumphal entry into the capital, and there were many citizens of Vienna forced to participate in the demonstration by threat of reprisals against their families. The author continues, incidentally, the official figures of the post-war census of Nazis in Austria are revealing. They show that for the whole of Austria, 536,000 persons were liable to be registered as members of the NSDAP. Of these, 98,000 were, quote, illegal, end quote, i.e., had belonged to the party before the Anschluss, which it was still illegal. Considering that the population of Austria at the time of the Anschluss was some 6.5 million, these figures are the clearest proof of how small the number of real Nazis was during those fateful days of 1938. We of the clergy have no need of such statistics, for we saw how the situation was for ourselves. We saw the way the wind was blowing for a long time, and we knew that all true Austrians protested against the shameful rape of their country by a man who had no place for God in his heart. There were many who were guilty of passive acquiescence, too lukewarm or too cowardly to resist. But we, the priests, knew from the hundreds who thronged our churches and sought us out in desperation in our rectories and monasteries and friaries. We knew that there were many who thought quite differently. Here's another passage. This is also from Why. Father John Lenz, he writes, St. John tells us that without faith, all is in vain, for faith overcomes the world. There were many who had no faith in those days, who having once fallen away from the church, were an easy prey to Hitler's substitute for religion. Where there was no living religion, the thorns of the Nazi doctrine grew up like the thorns in the parable. Only those who lived in the light of faith could recognize the danger behind the Nazi propaganda. Harmless enough, though it might first appear, and could see the power of the devil behind Hitler. But listen to this. Father John Lenz, he writes in a sub-passage called God is Love. Yet the mercy of God is boundless. No one need ever despair. Quote, if your sins be as scarlet, they shall be made as white as snow. End quote. This is from Isaiah 1:18. That is what the divine love offers us, the author writes. The Son of Man is our Redeemer, the hope of all truly penitent sinners who turn to him, trusting in his infinite mercy and love. Quote, I have loved thee with an everlasting love. Therefore have I drawn thee, taking pity on thee. Furthermore, a couple paragraphs later, he writes, to men of good will, however, the truth can bring nothing but good. For those willing to turn back to God, the truth can help them to find salvation, leading them nearer in love and confident hope and humility and a true spirit of remorse to him who suffered and died for them. It will lead them nearer to God. This is from the second chapter, and it's called Arrested. And I think this opening bit really sets the vibe for the scene around this era All right, so we're talking about 1938, Germany. Father Lenz, he writes, with the Nazi victory in March 1938, a new and dark era had begun for Austria. Our good Catholics were almost heartbroken. They came to us priests in their desperation in the hope of finding some kind of support, some consolation. These men and women were the true patriots of Austria. Men and women who remained true to their convictions in the face of the new ideology of the Hitler regime. These were the real Austrians. A heartwarming contrast to the new type of citizen of Hitler's, quote, Ostmark, end quote, as our country was now called. They seemed literally to spring up overnight. These new overbearing officials with their Hitler salutes and swastikas and photographs of the Fuhrer. Suddenly they were to be found everywhere, in the streets and offices and trams, loud-voiced and arrogant, the new Austrians. These were heartbreaking days indeed. You'll be the first of us to be sent to Dachau, prophesied my good friend Father Engelbert G. But his own sermons at May devotions had been no less outspoken. Not long after, he received a warning note from the police, but thank God, no further steps were taken. We knew that it was our duty as priests to speak out fearlessly against the godlessness of the new regime. I felt that it was more than ever imperative at that time to strengthen the belief in God's goodness, to inspire courage to remain true to our faith. I knew very well that I was in danger of arrest, but I knew too that I must obey the Holy Father Pius XI, who had categorically declared, the priest's first loving gift to his neighbors is to serve truth and refute error in any of its forms. Failure on this score would be not only a betrayal of God and your vocation, but also an offense against the real welfare of your people and country. So going into chapter 3, prison in Vienna. So this passage makes this very clear. We had all sorts of criminals as neighbors. Murderers, thieves, and firebrands, what the Nazis were fond of describing as, quote, the scum of society, end quote. And we knew that, in their eyes, we priests ranked no higher. Later in chapter 3, we have this passage. In his book, 1000 Days, Erwin Gostner describes a journey to Dachau toward the end of April 1938. Here, George Schelling, a priest who was later to become an outstanding personality in the priests' community in the concentration camp, was subjected to typical abusive treatment by the SS guard. "You black swine," the man swore at him. "I'd like to know how many of your so-called housekeepers you've," end quote. Then he punched him in the face with his fist. The priest submitted to the blow without a word, only raising his hand to wipe the blood from his lips. This served only to infuriate the guard still more. Then Father John Lenz, he continues, many priests had similar experiences on these prisoner transports. More than once, I myself thought death was imminent. I was quite prepared for anything. Above all, I had no illusions about our reception at Dachau. Dachau! The name already stank, and I knew I had small chance of coming out alive. I made a firm act of faith and placed my destiny in the hands of the Almighty. Thy will be done. I knew that, apart from anything else, this was the only way to achieve peace of mind.
That inspired the Nazi Party. It was a neo-pagan movement that hated Christ and hated religion. And whenever they got a Catholic priest under their thumb, they persecuted.
Okay, Jim.
Well, I don't agree.
Here's some more background of the situation. So in chapter 3, in a subchapter called The Elite of Austria, Father John Lenz, he writes, "It did not take me long to discover that I was in distinguished company here. My fellow prisoners were truly fine men, despite their convicts' clothing, men who had refused to deny their religious convictions. Martyrs for Poland, martyrs too for Germany. I found many Austrians, leading Catholics who had played significant roles in the political life of our country. And I was soon to learn that this little group of Catholics had already developed into an active center of spiritual power in the life of the camp. Austria had been the first victim of National Socialist foreign policy in 1938, and it was the Catholic statesmen who remained at their posts up to the end who were the first victims of the concentration camps of the godless dictator. It was these men who personified the best of the real Catholic Austria, who laid the foundation for us priests in the strange and complex world of the camp. There was a strong anti-religious element in the camp, and the real atheists and toughs were naturally prejudiced against the priests from the start. But these men, through their personal example, through their fearless daily manifestation of their faith, through their good humor and their Christian charity, paved the way for us among the other prisoners." Father John Lenz writes in the chapter The Beginning, "It must have been about 8 o'clock when an SS man who was our block commander and was responsible for the work detail caught sight of me. He flung me to the ground for no other reason than that I was a priest, and began kicking me, jeering and calling me names. I had to submit to all this in silence, but at least I could lie still for a few moments on the gravel and rest. But not for long. I soon had to get back to work with my wheelbarrow. Before long, my strength began to ebb again. I paused for a second to look quickly at my hands. 15 open wounds. If only my arms had not been so limp and helpless. The fear that this was to be my last hour summoned my last reserves of strength. O Jesus, how your steps must have faltered too after the terrible scourging, when you had to carry your cross. How heavy it must have been." Unquote. I simply could not go on any farther. I had to rest after every second step. I was no longer capable of even setting down my heavy load. The wheelbarrow simply fell out of my hands. One of the SS men who had seen this happened to came over and began to shout at me, "You swine! You cur! You priest! It's no good trying the go slow policy here. Sabotage. You're just refusing to work. That's all. I'll soon teach you." And he reached for his revolver. "Oh Jesus, mercy. Mary, help. I can't go on." Suddenly a shot rang out. Someone must have run into the sentry line, probably the young student. God have mercy on him. He was driven to this death by sheer desperation. 7 prisoners now within 2 days. The SS sentries found it fair game, but for us it was a terrible warning. The shot fired at that very moment proved to be my salvation. The SS man left me standing there and hurried off in the direction of the shot, anxious not to miss anything. He had forgotten all about me in his anxiety to see who had been killed off this time. I was safe, at least for a moment. So in chapter 5, called Gusen, we get insight about the prison transport to, quote, murderous Malthusson, unquote. And, in the book, earlier in the book, you get to find out a little bit about the transport system and how that sucked. Cramped in this sort of train meant for cattle, and you're being stuffed in there with a bunch of other unfortunate POWs or whatever kind of prisoners they want to take in. You're stuffed in there, and that you're on top of each other. There's bugs everywhere. I mean, that was awful for them. Father John Lenz, he writes, August 16th, 1940, a goods train bound for Motivational with 1,000 men packed into cattle trucks. I shall never forget this journey. The doors were locked, of course, and there were no windows. It was forbidden, on penalty of immediate shooting, to open the tiny peephole. 2 of the priests in our truck were suffering from diarrhea and had no way of getting out. Try going through that. Father John Lenz, he writes, in a subchapter, No Hope for the Sick, he writes, for those who had the misfortunes to fall ill, things were very hard indeed. There was virtually no one there to care for them, no one who wanted to help. If you were sick and managed to get admitted to the infirmary, you might possibly recover. If not, there was no other course but to go on working, and very likely die. Not that the infirmary was safe either. The prisoner orderly in charge of the diarrhea ward had openly stated that any priest admitted to his charge would come out a corpse. The man hated all priests as he hated God. It was a small wonder that we avoided the diarrhea ward, but the cases of this sickness increased. It didn't just stop there with the diarrhea. Another thing you had to deal with at night was around the camp and was lice steadily eating away at you, drinking your blood. Father John Lenz, he writes, these lice not only robbed us of our blood, and God knows we had precious little to spare, but they caused constant irritation and countless tiny sores. We often wondered how we would ever endure the coming winter if something were not done to ease our plight. The fleas were legion too. And just in case you didn't know, by legion, that's a term to describe demons, right? Because it's not just one, but a whole freaking army of demons. That's why they call them legion. The fleas were legion too, and they seemed much bigger than any we had ever seen before. It was almost as though the lice and the fleas had their own part to play in the plan to torment us to death by slow degrees. Father John Lenz, he writes in chapter 5 called Gusen, in November 1940, a large number of Polish prisoners were discharged from Gusen. Is it Gusen or Gusen? I don't know. Hope began to spring up throughout the camp, but things turned out rather differently. The men who were picked out on the afternoon of the appointed day were simply taken by truck to Malthusson and shot. One day I was working on the cesspool installations with some other prisoners when a young SS man came along. He was drunk. He knew that I was a priest and forced me into a religious controversy. I answered his attacks fearlessly, and he very soon saw that the game was lost from the start. He drew his revolver and pointed it at me menacingly. Then he lowered it and left. "That took guts," commented the communists nearby. But I nearly paid for it with my life. So for this next part, I'm going to talk to you about what Thanksgiving was like. So also in chapter 5, under Gusen, Father John Lenz, he writes, I never ceased to thank God for my suffering. And this, more than anything else, helped me to bear the cross of my imprisonment with fortitude. In the novitiate, we had frequently been urged to practice this act of faith and thanksgiving to this day. I have always found it of the greatest value, especially during the long years of internment in Gusen and Dachau. I cannot sufficiently impress upon my readers how this can help them in their own particular troubles and afflictions. To thank God for the trials He sends us in his infinite love for us is by no means easy and requires practice. But in the end, it will be seen to be well worthwhile. Every new beginning is difficult, as we all know. We must begin with the thanksgiving for the little crosses that we have to bear every day. In this way, we gradually proceed in prayer to the realization of the fact that every form of human suffering really comes from God in his goodness and wisdom. He sends us this suffering so as to prepare us for heaven. For this very reason, our thanksgiving for suffering is not only the finest test of our faith, but also our most powerful prayer to our Father in heaven. God, our Father, may chastise us in his loving wisdom, but if we believe in God and in his wisdom and love, how can we possibly fail in this act of thanksgiving? It represents our complete and unconditional surrender to God, who alone is all in all. It is our own free love given in return for his divine love. Only in this act of thanksgiving can we really experience what St. Paul tells us when he says, quote, I overflow with joy in every tribulation, end quote. Father John Lenz continues, earthly suffering is sent to us that we may grow and mature in spirit. No harvest can be reaped without toil and sweat. Every farmer knows that his corn must have time to grow and ripen, and no farmer will curse and swear and grumble because he has to work so hard. He knows very well that his hard work means that his barns will be full when he has reaped his harvest. It is just the same with our suffering here on earth. For in the life to come, our earthly happiness will count for little. It will be our suffering that will count then. The hard days of tribulation and hardship that will be our righteous pride, our joy, and our glory. Days for spiritual growth and readiness for the harvest of eternity. And so I could find no hatred in my heart for our persecutors. Quote, whatever these men do to me, end quote, I told myself, quote, it doesn't matter. They'll have to answer for it sometime. For no one can escape God's judgment. But that goes for me too. I'll have to answer for how I've borne this cross that God has placed on my shoulders here and now through these men, end quote. In this way, this time of suffering, terrible though it was immensely profitable. Nowhere else in the world, not even in the hardest school, could I have had such an inestimable spiritual training as in this bitter school of the concentration camp. I would not have exchanged those 5 years for all the gold and treasure in the world. These words are especially addressed to those who have a heavy cross to bear. Thanksgiving in suffering really does bring consolation. I had penance enough to do anyway for my own sins. God knew why he had sent me to this school, the hardest and most valuable of my life. Only when we are forced to endure the most profound suffering and hardship do we learn how to catch hold of God's hand in our misery. We learn to pray. This is called Goodbye to Gusen. And so here we go. December 6, 1940, and First Friday. It was a real winter's day, working away in the quarry. We were impervious to the cold, for we had heard that the commandant had received orders from Berlin to send all priests back to Dachau for discharge. The rumor was verified at midday when we priests received the old command, fall out. Our joy knew no bounds that afternoon as we were issued civilian clothing, a sure sign that we would soon be free again. Or so we thought. We had to undergo a final, quote, medical examination, end quote, in the sick bay at the hands of an untrained prisoner orderly. One of these good Samaritans suddenly fell upon an old Polish priest in a towering rage. "You," he snarled at him. "So you're just a simple peasant, eh? I'll teach you, you swine, you dog, you priest." And he set upon the unfortunate man with kicks and blows. It appeared that this Polish priest had been admitted to the sickbay only a few weeks before, and in order to save his life, he had told the dreaded orderly, who was known for his hatred of all priests, that he was a peasant. There were several priests and theology students who had been afraid to admit that they belonged to the clergy and had thus been entered into the camp records as laymen. They now remained behind at Gusen, and almost all of them died. So on to the last passage for this video. This is called, this is in the next chapter, chapter 6, called Back in Dachau. This is a subchapter, and it's called A Great Event. Christ in Dachau. January 15th, 1941, the author writes, "I was on my way back to our block that afternoon when I caught sight of a whole crowd of prisoners, many of whom I recognized as priests, collected outside Block 26. A Polish lay brother called out to me as I hurried across to see what was causing the commotion. 'We're to have a chapel in Block 26, he told me excitedly, his face shining. I felt sure that this was just another camp rumor, but I was wrong. I could see that they were already carrying away sections of the partitions that had divided the dormitory from the so-called living room. I too set to work, lending a hand where I could. I learned that Himmler was due to visit us within the next few days and expected to find the chapel finished, in accordance with the orders from Berlin. I could scarcely believe my ears. A similar order must indeed have been received already in August 1940 for Sachsenhausen. They had their chapel that summer. In Dachau, however, they had kept us in the punishment squad until December and waited until the last moment before they complied with the order for finishing of a chapel. But now Himmler was to come on a tour of inspection of this model camp, and the SS authorities had detailed Capo H to see that the chapel was completed as quickly as possible. And so work on Block 26 proceeded day and night, with Capo H strutting up and down, bellowing directives, bullying, cursing, and swearing. It had created no small sensation as the green glass windows painted with red crosses were carried across the barrack square, through the length of the camp and down the road to Block 26. The red Nazi flags hung limply on the camp buildings, and Christ's red crosses blazed in the winter sunshine. Christ's cross had triumphed in the hell created by the Nazi swastika. It was ironic that precisely this man had been chosen as the foreman of the working party for the chapel. He was a dangerous atheist with an unspeakable contempt for us priests. He was solely concerned with completing his unwelcome task as quickly as possible, viewing it as a waste of his valuable time. But he was efficient and a good enough organizer, and the chapel was finished by the evening of January 20th. "There you are," he announced irritably. "As far as I'm concerned, you can get on with it and hold your fine mass." He was only too glad that his task was complete. He had obeyed orders and provided us with a chapel and furnished it as best as he could. This was true enough, but the man was an atheist, and had no experience as a sacristan in his work for his Nazi masters. The chapel might well be finished in his eyes, but we had no bread and no wine. The essential offerings for the unbloody sacrifice were lacking, and we could not hold our mass. But by the morning of January 22nd, the host and the wine had been obtained, and we assembled for the first time in our new chapel. It was an unforgettable occasion for all of us. It was 5 o'clock in the morning, and outside was the darkness and misery of the camp. Inside, in the chapel, however, we had forgotten our misery in the joyful anticipation of the holy sacrifice of the Mass, of which we had been deprived so long. The priests stood there in their prison clothes, their faces drawn and haggard for hunger and lack of sleep, but radiant with a new inner joy. We were weary, half-starved, and lousy, but it would have been hard to find a happier group of men that winter's morning. Our camp chaplain, the Polish priest, Father Paul Prabzucki, was the celebrant. Each of us had taken one of the small hosts from the plate near the door of the chapel as we came in, and as the celebrant consecrated the hosts at the altar, the hosts that lay in the palms of our own priestly hands were consecrated simultaneously. We received Holy Communion together with him from our own hands, hands consecrated as paten at our ordination. Christus vincit. Christ conquers. This wonderful hymn of the Church of Christ resounded for the first time in our sanctuary that morning. Our hunger and every physical hardship were forgotten in the joyful realization that Christ himself was here with us in the Blessed Sacrament. Christ himself, our Lord, our God, was with us here in Dachau. Fellow prisoner with us behind barbed wire. Hell might rage outside, but Satan and his followers could not prevail against us. God often chooses the strangest instruments for his work. Through these godless men, he had manifested himself in the chapel they had furnished for him in a hut in their prison camp. Christ was in Dachau. Christ was victorious indeed. So that's going to do it for this book review. This has been a book review of Christ in Dachau, written by Father John Lenz. This is a very important book right now for our times. So as a last and final note, I also want to mention that if you like this sort of content, I'm going to keep bringing this type of content to you. So it's another reason for you to subscribe. I highly recommend you check out my E. Michael Jones book reviews and you check out his works. CultureWars.com is where you can find him. Let me know what you think about that. And for all my subscribers out there, thank you very much. You know, I'm trying to get to that goal of 500. So if you like my work, stick around, subscribe. It's totally free. I'm just trying to build something with this YouTube channel. We're going to keep moving forward with this, and we're going to keep sending it. So stick around. Thank you.